bring in the Director of Investigations and Enforcement at Campaign Against Antisemitism, Stephen Silverman. Thanks for joining us, Stephen. Keir Starmer has spent the last 2 days obsessively repeating, the Labour Party has changed under me. Now, I am beginning to suspect that the difference between the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party under Keir Starmer is just that Keir Starmer, I think in all fairness, is not an anti-Semite. He's married to a Jewish lady and he's done his best. But it is quite clear from the last couple of days, we know now that 5 more Labour MPs are under investigation for similar anti-Semitic charges, 2 of them front benchers. It is quite clear to me that the Labour Party still has a major problem with anti-Semitism.
Well, look, we need to be very realistic about this. Between 2015 and 2019, under Jeremy Corbyn's stewardship, the Labour Party became institutionally anti-Semitic, and the investigation conducted by the Equality and Human Rights Commission leaves us in no doubt about that. It is therefore inconceivable that for all the work that Sir Keir Starmer has put in, it has been possible to completely eradicate it since then. How do you go about eradicating it? Well, you can only do it when you become aware of things that people do and say. It stands to reason that there must still be a lot of people within the party at all levels who still hold the views that were problematic. They just haven't expressed them. So the real issue is, there are 2 issues. The first is Keir Starmer seemed to be doing pretty well, but the prevarication and obfuscation over Azhar Ali really damaged his credibility on the issue. And the second is, I think we've been led to believe to some extent that the work to purge the party of anti-Semitism is far further along than it really is. There needs to be honesty about it, and the work that has been carried out, the efforts need to be redoubled, because clearly it's still there. It's been pushed to the margins. It hasn't gone away, and it will find any opportunity that it can to resurface.
I mean, Sir Keir Starmer was pretty vocal with his own MPs at the time, saying, look, don't go and attend pro-Palestine marches. This is after, I think it was Zara Sultana liked an anti-Israel social media post, and the Labour candidate for Southampton allegedly attended a pro-Palestine rally in November. Is the difficulty that the Labour Party might find themselves encountering soon is all too often accusations of anti-Semitism, probably quite rightly, levelled against people from other communities, largely Muslim communities, who might find those views far more entrenched in their circles than perhaps other sections of the population, and that it's, in many respects, he's going to have to tread carefully that sort of equilibrium of offence.
Well, look, you know, you can't equivocate over racism. There's a line, there's a very clear line, and you have to decide what side of that line you're going to stand on, regardless of who you upset in so doing. Anti-Semitism has been one of the world's greatest evils. Yes, it initially affects Jews, but when it takes root, it is a sign that society is in real trouble, because discrimination against minority groups that don't fit the mold then has its head and can run riot, as we've seen in the past. So, you know, there are no 2 sides to this. You are either against racism and you're not. And if you are against racism, you have to accept that that might put some people's noses out of joint.
We're talking about, you know, the run-up to an election, but lest we forget, we still have a government, a Tory government. What we've seen since the eruption of the Gaza war is a veritable sort of outbreak, a kind of tsunami of anti-Semitism unfolding all over the country. I mean, even in respect of last night, poor Tobias Ellwood, a Tory MP who's very vociferous in his support for Israel, found a massive pro-Palestine demonstration outside his personal home with his terrified wife and kids quivering inside. And that demonstration was led by a former Labour candidate who stood against Tobias at the last election in 2019 by the name of Corey Drew. So once again, we have this problem. Now, you know what I'm talking about, Stephen. We are seeing, as I say, I would suggest a kind of tsunami of anti-Semitism. What should the government do to stop this? I mean, I think they've got to get tough, and they've got to get tough fast.
Well, look, I think the way to read this isn't that the events of the last few months have caused more anti-Semitism. What I think has happened is that it has enabled people who hold these views to feel empowered to be able to express them openly and vociferously and aggressively now. We've had lots of supportive words from the government. We haven't had much action. The recent legislation that bans masks is helpful, but that by no means is going to fix the problem. We need to see far more action by the police at these marches. The number of arrests that are being made in comparison with the number of offences that are being committed, and we know how many offences are being committed at these marches because we monitor them. The number of arrests is paltry. And if it is the case that the police do not feel they have sufficient manpower to be able to control the situation, should it become uncontrollable in the event of them attempting to make arrests, then the government needs to provide them with additional support. And until that starts happening, and until there are real, very clear, severe sanctions for what is happening at the moment, the problem is only going to get worse.
I mean, what I'm trying to say, Stephen, is, I mean, I live near Golders Green. I live in North London, where there is a very significant Jewish community, and Jewish people live next door to me. They live in my road. They're my friends. They're British citizens, and they are saying, we're talking about people who are 60 years old or whatever. They lived in this country all their lives, and for the first time, they feel terrified. For the first time, they're actually making plans to potentially leave this country because of what's going on. Something is happening that is worse than ever before. What do you make of that? What is causing it?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, the events since the 7th of October last year have released a simmering strain of anti-Semitism that has been kept below the surface. It's as though a plaster has been ripped off a gaping wound. We recently did some polling on how the Jewish community is feeling since October the 7th. We did this in November. Almost 70% say they would absolutely hide signs of their Jewish identity when they go out in public. 50% are saying they are thinking about or planning to leave the country because of the rise in anti-Semitism since then. 90% say they would not dare to venture into London during one of these horrendous anti-Israel marches, which have been taking place almost every weekend. It feels as though the situation is spiraling out of control. We're now seeing it translating into violent attacks on Jews in the street. There was a horrendous one in Leicester Square a few weekends ago, where a group of Jewish people in the early hours of the morning in Leicester Square were approached by a few young men. They were asked if they were Jewish, and when they said yes, a mob descended on them and they ended up having to go to hospital. We've seen, and I'm sure you'll be aware of the events at the Soho Theatre over the weekend, where a Jewish person was hounded out of the theatre, accompanied by a baying mob in the audience. Seems reminiscent of another era. So we are in a very, very serious place. Government needs to get a hold of it. Law enforcement needs to get a hold of it. And also education needs to get a hold of it, because it is a fact that at the moment in our schools, it is cool to be anti-Israel. That leads to anti-Semitism. It's worse in the universities. So there is the government needs a multi-pronged strategy in order to fix this. And if we start fixing it today, it is still going to be the work of at least a generation before we can even think about starting to put the genie back in the bottle.
Stephen, I think you're right. And, Alicia, I'm going to bring in you here, because it seems to me that what's happened is the result of an extremely potent cocktail of geopolitical events being carried out in the Middle East, but also the fact that for too long now, pretty much for the past decade, we've had it shoved down our throat that prejudice is fine as long as it's levelled against the privileged. That actually, if you've got a darker skin tone, you can say what you want carte blanche as long as it's against somebody party with a whiter skin tone. And what we have here is a culmination of people looking at the Jewish community and saying, well, you know, they seem to me largely to be white, and they seem to me also to be people, you know, the old anti-Semitic trope of impositions of power with money. Oh, look at Israel, isn't it more developed? And we've been constantly told by the left wing that actually that's okay, that, you know, you can't be told off for doing that. And now we're in this situation where, as Stephen is saying, it's going to take a generation to put the genie back in the bottle.
Definitely, and I think the reason why everything that's happened with the Labour Party over this past week is just so inflamed is because of how much time Keir Starmer has dedicated to saying he's clamping down on anti-Semitism within his party, and especially towards those MPs towards the left of his party. You know, he's sanctioned Andy McDonald, Kate Osamor, both for their comments about this conflict. And he said, you know, we're clamping down this is a changed Labour Party. And then we're having more and more revelations that actually imply it's not really fundamentally at its core a changed Labour Party quite yet. So I think all of that just feeds into this narrative that, you know, Keir Starmer and people like that, figures of the left, supposedly saying that they're really clamping down and something's changing. And then you kind of see these facts come up that prove quite the opposite.
Stephen, if we come back to you, I mean, imagine what I'm going to try to put across now is I think the problem with anti-Semitism was encapsulated in that, you remember that notorious letter that Diane Abbott wrote to The Observer that basically said racism against Jews is nowhere near as bad as racism against other people. And that's it. Now, put the case that I'm a Labour candidate and I stand up at a meeting like that bloke as Ali did, and I start ranting about, you know, black people using the N-word and stuff like that. And then I'm caught, like Azhar Ali was, and I apologise. And the Labour Party says, well, it's OK. He said sorry. Well, that wouldn't happen, would it? And yet, because it was only anti-Semitism, for 24 shameful hours, the Labour Party was prepared to accept this guy's apology. What we've got to do as a nation, it seems to me, is to get it straight, to get it on record that racism against Jewish people is just as bad as racism against anyone else.
I mean, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. And the problem is, Jews are the victims of a particularly brutal form of identity politics that sees the world through the lens of the oppressed and the oppressor. And because of the anti-Semitic trope that has already been highlighted, Jews are white, rich and powerful, which of course is absolute nonsense. They have been placed in the category of the oppressor because there is a Jewish state that also places them in the category of the oppressor because it is identified as an exercise in colonialism, whereas in fact, it marked the end of colonialism in that part of the world. So, you know, this is, and David Baddiel, of course, wrote his excellent book, Jews Don't Count, which identifies this very, very clearly. This all then gets mixed in with a strand of anti-Semitic thinking that has always been present in some parts of the left, and which came to prominence during the Corbyn years. So it is a bit of an unholy mess at the moment, and untangling it is going to take some really serious and dedicated work.
Yeah, Stephen, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Great to talk to you.
Alicia, really briefly, I mean, this is just one example of the culture wars now spreading. The Tories have sort of done their fair share of, I think, using it, frankly, to try and gain popularity. The Labour Party so far getting off rather lightly, considering some of the blunders made, whether it's about what is a woman and so on and so forth. But the culture wars are going to very quickly come knocking at Labour's door. And I think this is the sort of issue that could well divide the party.
Definitely, and this is definitely a flavour of what we're going to see as it gets closer and closer to the election as well, because culture wars, at the core of them, can often become quite nasty. It can become quite hateful. It can become, you know, two very divided sides really going at each other. So I think we're only going to see more of this as we approach the election. Keir Starmer can't really escape it, can't really just refuse to say, like he has been doing for a while. So ever since he kind of made a bit of a rumble with the whole what is a woman thing, he's kind of tried to avoid getting involved in this kind of stuff. But this just proves he can't for much longer.
Why doesn't he take these two people? They're on record, this Graham Jones guy and Azhar Ali. We've heard the tape. Why doesn't Keir Starmer say, well, not only are you you no longer Labour candidates, you're out of the Labour Party. I'm kicking you out. Why doesn't he do that? That would send a strong, that would send a decisive message that he keeps droning on about.
I mean, I guess the Labour Party would argue that they need to draw a line at something, and, you know, it becomes a difficult task. I mean, what is too far? What is crossing the line?
If you're anti-Semitic, you're out of the party.
Of course,
Ends.
that's the defence that's the defence that lots of them would use. Is, you know, do you oust absolutely everyone from the party who's ever said anything? That's probably what they'd say.
Yeah.
But then,
How about that? How about yes?
yeah. Well, yeah.
That's
I guess,
called being decisive.
and I'm sure that's probably what lots of people will pressure Keir Starmer to do in the coming weeks as well. They'll say, you know, we've seen that you have eventually removed this candidate, and then they were actually, in Labour's defence, quite swift with Graham Jones, the second candidate. But people will probably just say it doesn't go far enough. Why have they even ended up in the party in the first place? And I think that's the issue that Keir Starmer will have in the coming weeks.
I think he will. And let's hope he does. I mean, Keir Starmer knows which side his bread is buttered when it comes to certain constituencies and the voting blocks within them, that's for sure. Alicia Fitzgerald, our talkTV
Great to talk to you. Thank you, Alicia.
So much.